So you may have seen this before. Head over to GitHub, you go to a repo, and there's an option to deploy that current build. So here's a button, deploy to Heroku. You click on that button, that takes you to the Heroku service. Now I'm already logged in. So at this point, all I need to do is add a name for my app, just make sure it's available, and then I can just press deploy, and that will then just go ahead and start deploying that repo over here in my Heroku account. Once it's finished deploying, we can just press the view button. That takes us to the new app that was built. And there we go, the repository has now been deployed. So I'm going to take you through the process using Django, how to prepare your Django application so that you can then create a deploy to Heroku button in your GitHub repo so anyone can come along and just test out your repo. So I'm going to start with part 9 of the Django e-commerce project. The code is in the description. So let's go ahead and get this started with Visual Studio Code. So if you're new to this, I'm just going to create a new virtual environment in my folder here. And then I just need to activate it, of course. Okay, so I'm going to actually get this project working first, because there's no point deploying something when obviously the project doesn't work. So we might as well just test it here locally to make sure the project does work before we actually deploy it. So let's just pip install the requirements that are here. And then let's just start off just to make sure it's working. And then we can go into the browser and just double check it works. And there we go. So it looks like it's working okay. Preparing our application for Heroku is very similar to the process we would take normally if we wanted to deploy our application to the Heroku service. To get this working, we need to start off by building a new file called the proc file. Okay, so this is a file that Heroku needs, and in here we're just going to define the fact, or we're going to define how we want to run this application. So here, web, we're going to be using the Gunnyhorn package or server to run our application. You can see here we're pointing to our WSGI file, which is going to be in our main project folder, and then WSGI right there. So that's essentially how, this is the command, Gunnyhorn command, that we're going to get this server started. So that's going to start the server. So that goes into your proc file. So just be careful here, right? Because this is super sensitive. Maybe a spacing correct here. So follow it exactly like that. Otherwise you will have problems. So when we deploy our application to Heroku, it is going to be running from the Gunnyhorn server. So we need to make sure that that's in our requirements. So we're going to need to add that to our requirements. Now I'm here in Windows. I would actually show you and test this out by running this command here. But in Windows, we can't run Gunnyhorn by default. So I can't show you that. So all we need to do here then is just go ahead and add Gunnyhorn to our requirements text. So I'm just going to add it here to the end. So this is the latest version as of recording 20.1.0. So that's going to be installed when everything gets sent across to Heroku. I don't need to install that now, but I've added it right there. So now we need to give Heroku some metadata. Tell it about what type of application this is and how it's going to run, etc. So what we can do is create a new file here. So we're going to call this one app.json. And this is basically going to be some instructions, like I said, for Heroku, so it knows what type of app we want to run and so on. So we can give it some additional parameters, some deployment parameters, if you like. So some of the simple parameters we can set up, the name, for example. We can also have a description, whether this is required. It's just optional kind of things here, potentially. We could also set out a repository. So that's the repository where Heroku is going to find and utilize to deploy. So this is a repository that Heroku is going to deploy. And then we have here a website. Again, that's an additional optional. And we've got some keywords we can add if we want to. That's all good. And at this point, there's a few other parameters. So we can define something called a build pack. So this is going to be utilized. I guess we could think of this in some respects. In order for us to deploy Django, what do we need? Well, we need Python. So we're going to need a build pack. So on the instance where our Django application resides, it's going to need Python. So we use this build pack here from Heroku, the Heroku build pack Python, and that's going to be installed alongside of our application. Of course, Python's needed to run Django. So I'm going to keep this nice and sweet and simple, but what we can also do, for example, is set up some environment variables. So if your application works with environment variables, we can pass that across when we build, so we can then add them into our application. So if you're not too sure what environment variables are, don't worry. That's not a problem. We're going to ignore them in this tutorial. But here we're essentially just passing over these values to our instance so that it can be read by our application. So these are just values or variables we're going to send across to our application if we're setting up environment variables within our application. So here I can set allowed host, debug, or whatever it is you might want to set within your application. Maybe there's some AWS passwords or keys, API keys, etc. So that pretty much is what we're going to be utilizing here to deploy our application. So now we need to talk about static files. So this is a sticking point for lots of users that I find trying to deploy to Heroku. You need to have this configured correctly. So if you go over to your main folder, your main project folder, and your settings, let's just drop this down. So at the bottom here, you probably have some settings set up, or you may not have. So here I've got the static URL set up. So the static folder. So let's just remind ourselves, a static folder is going to have, in our case, when we deploy, it's going to have the admin CSS. So it's going to style the admin side of things. So you're going to see that being copied across here. We won't see it, but it will be copied across to the static folder to be served when a user goes into the admin area. But here you can see we already have some CSS for our application here in the payment module and the core module. So that's going to provide some CSS for our site, and we want to keep that there. So what's going to happen when we deploy this application to Heroku? It's going to run the collect static, and that's going to find all the admin CSS and add it into the static folder. And then it's going to be served from this URL, which is the static URL. So technically what we should be able to do when we deploy our application is go to our URL/static, and that should take us to that folder. Similar to the media folder, there's going to be files in there. So we want to make that available. So there are three settings, and I have to keep reminding myself of this. But there are three settings: the static URL, which is utilized for the website to find the static files. There's the static route. So this is a path that's utilized by the system to find the static folder. So that's where all these static files are going to be based. And then there is a third one we can set up too, which is the static file directory. So if my memory serves me correct, this is another file or folder somewhere maybe you've set up, and you want to copy across all of these files into the root into your static folder. So this just allows you to kind of extend files that aren't, and add those files into the static folder if you have any in your project. Right, so all we need to do is set up the static URL and the static root. So those are the two parameters that we need to set to get this working, and they're both set to the static folder which is already created. And it is important that we create a folder, otherwise this won't work. Now what you might fall into the trap of is making a folder and it's empty, and then what you do is you then push that over to your GitHub repository and everything's okay. Well, it isn't. If you don't have anything inside of that folder, it won't get pushed across over to your repository, and there won't actually be a folder. And many times I've seen people, students have this problem, spend hours on it, and it's just, that is a simple case of just making sure that there is something inside of a static folder so it then gets pushed across to your GitHub repository. So deploying can be a very frustrating process. One small problem, a space, a comma in the wrong place, and it will all fall down. So now we've got that in place, what we need to do now is, because we're going to run this on our server in debug mode, true. So we're still in development mode here at the moment. So we're not utilizing this for deployment. It's just going to be for development mode. So what we're going to do is if we go into let's go into our main app again, which was the e-commerce, and in this case, settings. Oh, sorry, URLs. So inside of here, what we have, if we drop this down, we set up a URL path for the media route. So what we've done essentially there is we've added a new path manually to the media route folder based upon the media route parameter in the settings. So if you go in the settings here, we've got the media route and media URL, and that takes us to the right folder that we want to utilize. So what we need to do is the same thing again, but for the static folder. And then that will then essentially just register it as a URL path. So when we deploy it to Heroku, we'll actually be able to navigate to that path, and those files will actually be seen by our application. And so they become usable by our application. So in actual fact, all we need to do here is just copy this, but change where it says media over to static. And there we go. So that will set up our static. So again, this is just really, you can see here while we're in development mode, that's going to be the case. The setup is going to be slightly different when we actually go to deploy mode. Okay, so now we've got that in place. What we're going to need to do now is just fire this over to our GitHub repository and then test it out. So let's go ahead and run our manage py file and then collect static. So you can see here, and this is good to try out before we actually deploy this, because if it doesn't work here, it's not going to deploy on our Heroku server. So here it says the static directory settings should not contain the static route setting. Right, so if you go back into settings here, it looks like we've got the static directory here, and I do apologize, we just need to get rid of that. So just make sure you've not got that. So now let's go back and try again. It's going to say, are you sure about overwriting, sorry. So in the static, I do have some folders, but as long as it's not called admin, you'll be okay. Because you'll see as soon as you press yes here, you can see we've copied across all the admin, CSS, fonts, JavaScript, and images. And that's pretty much all that's needed for the Django backend, the admin backend. So that's all going to be there and it's going to be served from there. So if that works, we're all okay. We can go ahead and just delete that, of course. Okay, so now we're ready to push over to GitHub. So whatever you do, however you do that, I'm assuming you can deploy your application over to GitHub. If not, maybe just download the GitHub desktop tool. I do apologize for this. I was making the assumption that you knew how to do this. So maybe set this up, log in, set this up, and then create a new repository, give it a name, and then just put all your files across into that. So I'll just quickly take you through the process if you've not used this before. So create a new repository. Let me do that. And then show in Explorer, copy your files across to this folder. When you're ready, push publish to repository, and then just select where you want to publish it, keep it private or not. Now, if you want other people to deploy this, obviously this shouldn't be private, sorry. So deselect that, publish repository. Once that's done, you'll then need to click this button to then push that over to your main repository or your actual repository online. Right, so with that done, let's now go ahead and think about how to build the button. So you're going to need to have a README file. That's then this markdown file is utilized in your GitHub repository. That's what you're looking at when you go over to, for example, here, and you're looking at all these files here, or this text here. That's all in your README file. So going back here, what you're going to need to do is just create a new button. There we go. So what I do have is an extension. I haven't got it turned on, I don't think. So I've got the extension, the markdown extension here. So I'll just enable that. If I do that, what I'm going to have is a nice little preview window here where I can preview what it's going to look like. So you can see that this code here. So having a look at this code here, it just says .com. This is the link to the button, and then this is just a link to deploy. So notice there's no reference here to my application. So that creates this nice little button here. Now what you can do is you can test this yourself before you actually build this button. Now, if you follow the Heroku guidelines for this, basically what you need to do is build a link. So let me just close all this down. Just quickly show you this link. So the link is going to look something like this, right? So Heroku.com deploy $template equals, and then it's your actual GitHub repository. So if you just run this, it'll work exactly the same as building that button. Now this is just for you just to copy and paste into your browser and it will run it. So that's just something you can do to kind of test to begin with. Right. So in actual fact, that should be it. That should be it. Now this is a frustrating process. So the code, if you want to have a look, is here, right, in the Django e-commerce. There is a link in the video description, but have a look at the main core file. So the proc file, have a look at that, mirror that. Then of course the app.json file. So just make sure that that is similar to yours. And then once that's done, don't forget in the requirements, you're going to need to add your gunny horn. So that needs to be in there. So that's the third stage. Once you've done that, just make sure that you go into the settings and then just make sure in here you've got both the static URL and the static root set. So just have a look at this code here if you're not too sure, and then make sure that you're in your URLs. So here I do bring in static here in settings. So that's required for these lines of code here. So if settings.debug, here I've created the URLs. So that's pretty much the setup that we got here. Let's go ahead and just now deploy this again. And so you can see once you press the button, you're presented with the app name that you need to type in, the region of the servers you want to utilize. And here I've just left in some environment variables which you can change. They make absolutely no difference to mine at the moment because I don't actually have environment variables set up in my application. That was just there just to let you know that you could do that. So press deploy app and you're good to go. Now there was one thing that I didn't mention in actual fact, which would be something that you need to do. And that is, of course, and this would come up and you're probably well equipped to fix this problem. But you'll need to go into, I'll quickly show you. You'll need to go into your settings file. So if you go into the e-commerce and then settings, inside of here, you've got the allowed hosts. Now, just for now, I've set the allowed host to star, and that just basically allows any host to run this application. It's obviously not recommended for deployment, etc. And you could just put Heroku in there if you wanted to, so .herokuapp.com. So that would also work there as well. So that just ensures that this application would work on any domain that it was installed in for now. So just make sure that's set. Now, if you don't set that properly, all that will happen is your application will run, but it will just tell you like it would do if you're running the application locally, the Django app locally, that the host hasn't been set up correctly. So you just need to set that. Now, if you do have a problem, let's go back. If you do have a problem, let's just go over to Heroku. Then what you can do, if you select the app that you've just made, go to more and then view the logs. You'll be able to view the logs and it'll probably come up with different code issues or problem code, sorry. So that's also a good way of deploying or checking to see what the problem is. And you can then use those codes, search on Google, and you maybe be able to get a response to that particular problem. So there is likely to be a few problems if you haven't set this up perfectly. Again, it is something that you would need to set up perfectly. So once you have created an application and it fails, it's always best to start again. So if you wanted to delete your app, you just click on your app, go to settings, and at the bottom here will be the deletion button. So just go ahead and press delete. And you're going to need to copy and paste in the name of the app, and then it's deleted. Okay, so that's pretty much it then for a quick overview of how to build that button, deploy to Heroku, or allow others to deploy your application from GitHub over to Heroku servers.